Welcome to this, our second AfOx Digital Insaka. I'm aware there's a good number of people joining us from fairly incompatible time zones. Do let us know where you're joining us from in the chat if you can. For those who are joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. Insaka talks cover all areas of academia and attract experts in the topics discussed, as well as a much broader research audience interested in all things Africa. And in that spirit, today we will listen to two exceptional talks, one on why we should care about paleontology and the other on the future of research in African universities. Arguably, both very topical subjects in a context where there's ongoing heated debate and activism about reviewing and rewriting history to more accurately reflect our shared humanity. And of course, reflecting on the present and the past to better project into the future is crucial in all aspects of life, not in the least in higher education, and specifically the future of research in Africa. We are delighted to have two fantastic speakers on our panel today. First, Alison Lewis, who is Professor of Chemical Engineering and Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and the Built Environment at the University of Cape Town. Alison has spent a considerable amount of time leading and coordinating work on the future of African research universities. And also on the panel is Isaiah Nengo, a leading Kenyan paleontologist who is Associate Director at Turkana Basin Institute and splits his time between Stony Brook University in New York and the Institute in Kenya, where he's also Research Director. His fieldwork in Kenya has led to discoveries of many fossil apes, and most recently, that of the 13-million-year-old infant ape skull nicknamed Alesi. Alesi, I believe, is the word for ancestor in the Turkana language. Each speaker will give a 15-minute talk, and following both presentations, respond to questions which will have been posted online. So please use the chat to post your questions. First then, why should Africans care about paleontology? Professor Isaiah Nengo, over to you.
Thank you, Watu. To most people, paleontology is that cool subject where the scientists are involved in digging up dinosaurs. And so one would wonder, why would such an esoteric or seemingly esoteric science be of interest to Africa and Africans? And I think that it is of interest to become aware that there is a problem that we're all very interested in, and that paleontology has a potential solution to this very big problem that we are interested in. So what I want to do is I want to frame the problem and then use the rest of the time to try to explain how paleontology can help us to deal with that problem. And the problem is that of the existential threat that is posed by the racial caste system that has been in operation for over 400 years across the globe. Now, if you come to think of it, you get to realize that just having black skin has been a death sentence for over 400 years. It has been a death sentence for millions of Black people who perished in the transatlantic slave trade. It's been a death sentence for millions of Black people in Congo murdered under the brutal colonial rule of King Leopold. It's a death sentence for the millions whacked to death, lynched, and murdered in race riots across the United States during and after slavery. A death sentence for hundreds of young Black men in the United States killed by police over the past 10 years. And as we all witnessed recently, it was a death sentence for George Floyd, murdered in cold blood in the streets of Minnesota, casually having a knee on his neck and his breath cut off. I mean, it was just terrible. Now, paleontology matters because if we understand that science, and to a great degree religion as well, are the sources of the powerful constructs that are used to justify white supremacy and the superiority of all other races over the so-called Black race. And the construction of this justification goes back to 1775, and the founder of the discipline we call anthropology, Franz Blumenbach, willed, if you may, into existence the 5 races that we all identify with today. And then soon after, Francis Galton then infused it with the notion that racial differences are genetic. So the inferiority that Black people supposedly possess is genetically transmitted from generation to generation, like a scarlet letter from one generation to another. Now, paleontology matters because recent data from our discipline proves to be the linchpin in the functional deconstruction of this racial caste system. The physical evidence of the real story of how we became human is written only in the rocks in Africa, and particularly in Eastern and Southern Africa. The ancestors we share with the apes evolved in Africa about 20 million years ago. The root of the family, of the human lineage, 7 million years ago, was in Africa. The emergence of our family, the human family, the genus that we call Homo, over about 2 million years ago, was African. The growth of the brain, the expansion of the brain, one of the features that distinguishes us with our close cousins, the chimpanzees and the gorilla, that expansion took place in Africa over 2 million years ago. The very development of tool technology, I mean, now you see all this wonderful stuff, computers, Tesla, cars, we're sending people to the moon, but none of that happens if we don't, if our ancestors about 3 million years ago don't figure out how to begin to use technology in a sustained way. And that happened in Africa as well. We should care because the evidence from Africa tells us that all humans are African, and to be human is, in fact, African. As the birthplace of modern humans, or the species Homo sapien, the African continent has been inhabited continuously for over 200,000 years by humans, at least twice as long as the human career in any other continent. Africa is the birthplace of creativity, the symbolic expression that is so central to us through art, through music, dance, and a sense of style. It is the place where we first develop the capability to organize in large numbers by rallying around abstract symbols and ideas. We know now that the bulk of the DNA that every human being across the planet carries is African. Africans differ from one another slightly more than from Eurasians. All right, so if we lump all Africans and all we focus on is the color of the skin, we fail to understand that if you ignore the color of the skin, that Africans actually do have a great deal of the genetic diversity that are found in humans in total. And the genetic diversity in Eurasians is largely a subset of the diversity that you see in Africans. And that is because of the long human career that human beings have had in Africa. And so along with that genetic diversity, our linguistic diversity, nearly 1/3 of all languages in the world today are associated with more than 2,000 ethno-linguistic groups identified in Africa. What does that mean? It means that Africa is a gold mine of scientific evidence about us. There's a lot of information that has not been gathered about how we came to be. I mean, we've had genetic studies done in Europe. We've had a substantial amount of surveys of genetic diversity done in America and Eurasia. But we've barely scratched the surface of understanding the amount of genetic diversity that is actually in Africa. The linguistic and cultural diversity in Africa has not been properly studied. And the work that I do myself, the evidence, the physical evidence that tells us about how we became human, that work to dig up this past history is barely being scratched. The institute that I work at, the Turkana Basin Institute, has been set up specifically to help us to address this problem. So we've built these two very large physical facilities around Lake Turkana, where about 80% of the evidence that tells us about how we became human is to be found. And so scientists can come and they have facilities, they have, it's kind of like the active field research station of paleontology. And we really have now set up a situation where going down the line, we're going to be able to increase the evidence that will lead us to better understand about who we are and how we came to be. Now, paleontology matters because it is the anchor, therefore, of the evidential truth that tells us how we became human. But however, it is important that we realize that the number of us Africans, the number of Black people that are actually involved in the process of gathering the evidence, in the process of telling the story, is actually very small. And it is important that we have programs and we have concerted efforts to marshal resources to make sure that many of our people are able to get into this into these disciplines. A good example would be in Kenya. We have, in Kenya, we roughly have about 100 people who come through every year to study the material that we've collected so far or to collect new material. But there are only 6 Kenyans. There are hundreds of people coming through to Kenya. It's the same story in Ethiopia. It's the same story in South Africa. But there are only 6 Kenyans who are trained to be engaged in this storytelling. And so it is quite important that we make sure that our governments, we make sure that our institutions, that especially in light of the recent, as a result of the murder of George Floyd and the discussions that it has, the demonstrations and the discussion that it has triggered across all institutions, it is quite important that in Africa we don't get left behind in these discussions, and our own governments put in the resources to allow us to be able to participate in the process. And I know we get it. I know some of us get it. I know that the president of Kenya gets it, because about last week, he had issued a directive to this new management organization that he put together to clean up the city of Nairobi, to build the roads. And he was inspecting the work that they did. And in his comments, about a 12-minute comments, at the end of the comments, the president said that, look, we have to clean up the city because this is the cradle of mankind. And in the words of Malcolm X, you cannot love a tree and hate its roots. So paleontology matters because it is the anchor of the evidential truth that we are all human. we are all African, the truth that Black lives matter, and the truth that Black lives matters shall set all lives free. Thank you.
There. What a great statement. To be human is to be African. That was a very illuminating presentation. We will now swiftly move on to the second talk, leaders, followers, or spectators, African research universities and the future. Professor Alison Lewis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Watu, and thank you, colleagues. As Watu said, I'm going to talk about leaders, followers, or spectators. And here is a picture of my beautiful campus, University of Cape Town, currently closed due to COVID. I'm going to start in a slightly different place to my colleague, Professor Nengo, but interestingly, I think I'm going to end up in quite a similar one. So my question to start is, when you think of the future, what do you think of? Does something like this come to mind? Maybe this? Endless Zoom meetings and staring at a screen? What about this? A cool global house of the future? Brain-computer interfaces? My doctor is a robot? The Internet of Things? Artificial intelligence? Possibly you're thinking of a utopian kind of a future, quite tech-driven, lots of hope. Or maybe you're thinking of something like this, the supposed negative externalities of the third industrial revolution. Or this, the effects of climate change. Or this installation, which I particularly like, it's called Politicians Discussing Climate Change. And it's an installation in Berlin, installed in 2011. And I'm sure those same politicians are still there discussing climate change today. Or this, maybe this is your view of what the future might look like. For us at universities, there's also doom and gloom. There's a sense that university credentials are outdated. There are books called The End of College, Jonathan Jansen, South African academic's recent book, The End of the South African University, and then other texts around what a new university might look like, Minerva, Building the Intentional University. There's an idea that higher education is actually heading towards its own creative destruction. And in fact, that we passed that point. We've gone through the phase of creation. We've done the driving and the athleticism. We've gone through the building phase. We've gone through the engineering phase. We've passed our peak. And for universities to survive, we're going to have to actually reinvent ourselves and get ourselves past this point of creative destruction. So in response to all these ideas of a future accelerating, questions around the future of universities, questions around the fourth industrial revolution, Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, set up a futures think tank at the university. And our brief as the think tank was, how should the way we work at UCT change as a result of the rapid changes in the world? The think tank itself was a small, and still is a small and nimble group of insiders and outsiders. The instruction was, be dynamic, be renegade, and think outside the box. So we looked at all this pressure and noise and decided there were three options for the university. Do nothing, jump on the bandwagon, or disrupt ourselves, or face being disrupted. First of all, the do nothing option. So this is a great favorite of universities, especially old research universities. And I have a beautiful quote from Clark Carr, who says, it's quite a famous quote, who says, about 85 institutions in the Western world established by 1520 still exist. The Catholic Church, a few parliaments, several Swiss cantons, and 70 universities. So we are the experts at not changing. If you look at the picture I have here, it's Balliol College in Oxford in the 1870s. If you replace these carts with cars and the pedestrians give them a few iPhones, you pretty much would see a very, very similar scene today. Do nothing is also particularly relevant for research universities, because the greater the investment in the existing knowledge and systems, the slower the pace of change. And we are very, very heavily invested in our deep knowledge and systems, and therefore very, very reluctant to change. The second option is jump on the bandwagon. And so there, for us as a university, there was a strong pressure to ignore the driving forces and the promises and the scares of the second and third industrial revolutions, to buy into this kind of future hype, the frenzy around 4IR and all the jargon, react to the fast pace and all the fear with knee-jerk kind of tech-centric solutions. And the last option was this idea of disrupting ourselves or being disrupted, with the idea that if we don't determine our own future, it's going to be determined for us. Also, that universities actually can and do change. If you look at Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard, and his book, The New Education of 1869, and the reforms in the US system, you'll see that actually we've come a very, very long way since feudal universities. Refusing to change means that we will become obsolete, and the only way to lead actually in this moment is to disrupt ourselves. So we posed ourselves as the Futures think tank a new question. How can we shape, lead, and make the future in a rapidly changing world? So if you look at that question, you might say, sure, isn't that arrogant or empty? And the argument there is, in fact, Africa is the continent of the future. We are the equivalent of the new world. We have the youth bulge, 250 million youth today and 840 million in 2050. I just think all those university students out there. And we also have 6 out of 10 of the fastest growing economies in the world. The other question is, how can we lead and shape? What about all the other big serious universities in the US, the UK, and the EU? Well, they're also under pressure. There's the extreme pressure and drivers of rankings and metrics. There's revenue pressures, extreme competition between institutions for students and for revenue, a kind of acceleration of internationalization, looking for students and revenue, the issue of high student fees in the US and in the UK, and this idea that an education is an investment in a future career and threatening kind of traditional concepts of educational values. So in our Futures think tank exercise at my university, we did a big focus area set of workshops on what do we value? What are the important values for us as an institution? And we came up with some clusters, a cluster of values around creating a better society, and a cluster of values around growing leadership and how our graduates can change the world. And out of this exercise, we came up with our vision, which was unleash human potential to create a fair and just society. And we were mighty pleased around this. This was at the end of 2019, early 2020, and we thought this was an excellent North Star kind of vision for the university to take us going forward. And then, of course, COVID hit. And what's interesting to me about the whole COVID-19 pandemic is the fact is it has revealed to us all of the fractures and fissures that are already there in the substructure. It's revealed massive global inequality. It's revealed the fragility of the public healthcare system and what actually is an essential service and essential professions. It's also, interestingly, revealed a hidden reservoir of trust in science. And so my view is that our vision as a university to unleash human potential to create a fair and just society hasn't changed and shouldn't change as a result of COVID. And in fact, it's even more relevant. for us going forward. Our question of the moment would be, what opportunities does this current crisis open up to achieve these goals of unleashing human potential? And I'm going to answer that in three ways. Firstly, reframing our narrative. Secondly, driving change from the inside. And thirdly, using this opportunity. So in reframing our narrative, I can refer to many comments made by my colleague, Professor Nengo, around Africa as a continent. And if The Economist can take Africa from being the hopeless continent in May 2000 to Africa rising in December 2011, then we can certainly put Africa back on the map. And I find this picture rather interesting, which is the landmass of Africa filled in with other countries, which in our minds, I think, are often much, much bigger than Africa as a continent. So the continent of Africa can contain within it the whole of China, the whole of the United States, India, Eastern Europe, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and Japan. And I find that very illuminating, but especially around this whole idea of us reframing our narrative. Africa's more than just resources and labor. Our decolonization project has got far-reaching effects. It includes new ways of seeing. It includes working beyond silos. It includes students being more than just exploitable consumers. It includes working with the planet and its resources, building meaningful collaboration outside the university. So I think decolonization is not just about the colonies itself, but it's about having a global influence. And that's what we're using this moment for. The second proposal I have is to drive change from the inside. And as I said before, universities are difficult to change. So we've created a Futures Catalyst at UCT, which is an independent entity acting as a catalyst for change. It's a small group. It changes and varies according to the project. It consists of agitators, activators, some external advisors, and has got senior institutional support. Its role is to identify new opportunities and act as a connector across silos. And so one example that I can give is our Living Labs project, which involves installing solar PV or photovoltaic cells on campus buildings, using them to not only save electricity bill, but also to integrate teaching, research, sustainability ideas across the campus and work across the silos that we traditionally exist in. And the last point I want to make is around turning the crisis into an opportunity. If you look at this diagram on the left that I have, it comes from the World Economic Forum. It's an 18-month post-COVID risk projection. And you'll see they propose the likelihood of prolonged global recession and so on with different percentages. And my comment around this picture is that COVID has shifted the focus to crisis mode, but it's also revealed the substructure. And unlike this diagram, which is an 18-month risk projection, universities can and think and contribute long-term and systemically, and that's what we're good at, and that's what we should be doing. We also have the ability to generate ideas and to make links. So unlike in this picture where everything's separate and each category exists independently, we have the ability to link the exposure of global poverty and link that to climate change, economic systems, urbanization, all sorts of really important issues. And lastly, the role of the humanities, which is often underestimated and doesn't come to the fore in pictures like this. And the university is a really good place for the humanities to play a very important role. So in ending, I'd like to propose that we need to seize the day. The current crisis and the way that it's unfolding gives us the opportunity to step forward as leaders, not followers or spectators. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Alison Lewis, for those very bold and inspiring reflections. If we don't determine our own future, it will be determined for us. How sobering. And actually, it has very strong echoes with a reflection that Isaiah made when he said there are very few African researchers involved in the paleontology work in the various countries where it's ongoing. And the fact that we are not really involved in telling our own story, which obviously is, again, very sobering, and clearly something needs to be done there. So perhaps I could start with one question. There are lots of questions that have come in and we have plenty of time to go through that. But one of the questions I'd like to begin with is, Professor Isaiah Nengo, what do you think could be practically done to deal with this situation where we are not telling our own story sufficiently, even if we know all these facts about the fact that to be human is to be African?
Right. I think that a good place to begin would be to engage with our political leadership. I think in Kenya, it really is time, and I would say in Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Sudan, and South Africa, that we need to engage with the leadership to get them to understand the significance of this story, you know. And like I said, I think the president of Kenya gets it. I mean, the story of how we become human is in Africa. This is your story. And if it were America that had the evidence for that story, they would be shouting it over the rooftops. You know, so I think the first step is for us to engage that political leadership, get them to understand what it is that they have, and then from there we would follow the process of setting up of the right task forces in order to come up with a plan on how to because we're gonna need to infuse our curriculum from kindergarten all the way to university, and we're going to need to build museums. We're going to need to have stories in newspapers, stories written, carried in television. But I think it all begins with, first of all, engaging our political leadership to get them to understand just how deep this is.
Thank you very much. And quite a few related questions for Alison. One of them is, in determining our own futures, would Africa benefit from creating our own university league table?
That's a very interesting question. I think that league tables come with problems. I think that the way that metrics and rankings have been set up causes universities to play the game, so to speak. And there's a really interesting book actually written by a fellow South African called Chris Brink, called The Soul of the University. And he writes about how rankings and metrics, depending on which ones you use, can make any university top in anything that you choose, as long as you choose the right scale. And in fact, how it's interesting how rankings and metrics have proliferated. Every year or two or couple of years, there's a new ranking and a new metric and a new way to be top in the field. So I think that that's the one caution. The other caution is that rankings and metrics drive behavior. So, for example, if the number of publications published by a university adds to the ranking, then there'll be a pressure at that university for academics to publish numbers of publications and not necessarily look at the quality of the publications. So I think you have to be very, very careful how you frame your drivers and what happens around the unintended consequences. So I would, after that rambling response, probably say no, I don't think a league table is a good idea for African universities. I think that's playing into the wrong game, and I think it's emphasizing the wrong values. And I think, back to what I said in my talk, if we want to be leaders and really shape the conversation, we have to actually think of new ways to have the conversation and not follow in that old path of rankings and metrics.
Thank you. A related question follows very nicely onto that. It asks, how do we build new places of research and education which are equal and equitable, which can challenge racial hierarchies and inequalities? Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the critical question. And I only have experience really of the decolonization discussion that's happened in South Africa around exactly that. So our universities are places which are extremely hierarchical, very unequal, relatively exclusive, all of those things. And a lot of the work around the decolonization discussion has been having exactly that conversation: how to be more inclusive, how to be able to incorporate diversity, diverse voices, how to rethink our curricula. I mean, everything that we have is really a kind of a template of what comes to us from a kind of a colonial mindset. And I think even the fact that we work in faculties and in disciplines is an issue that I think is up for question. So to me, there are lots and lots of interesting conversations to be had. And I think we're really at the beginning of that journey. Thanks.
And on that very last comment you've just made there, here's another follow-on question. Where does decolonization of universities fit in the plan to make African universities leaders and not mere spectators in the current fast-changing world?
Yeah, I think I answered that a little bit in my talk. Maybe I rushed over it a bit, but I think that the whole decolonization discussion starts around new ways of seeing, around working across silos and not being divided into disciplines and the taxonomy of the current university. It hinges on being respectful towards the planet and not seeing it as a source of resources, and working collaboratively. So I think all of those things are actually quite radical new ways of working. And in my mind, if we have the courage to really take those discussions on, then we can offer leadership in that discussion.
Thank you. Going over to Isaiah now, considering the way ignorance about biology of race contributes to racism, do you feel that anthropology should be broadly taught in high schools or even earlier? How can African universities work together to build a stronger future?
Right. I think that if you look at in Kenya, for example, there is an anthropology program, but that anthropology program is the only anthropology program in the country, in a university in Kenya, even though we have over 50 universities. But that anthropology program is mostly geared towards social anthropology and not towards what we're talking about here. So I think that the right place to begin is at the university by creating and supporting programs, departments that specialize in these areas, and that means that we'd have to train the people. In the institute that I work with, the Turkana Basin Institute, is partnering with one of the universities in Kenya, the Turkana University College, which is a very brand new, young university way out in up north. And we've started this innovative master's program because we realized that you cannot start at the bachelor's because you don't have enough people trained in Kenya to be able to teach enough courses for one to get a bachelor's degree. And of course, you can start with the PhD for the similar reason as well. So we figured we could start with a master's program. And, but, you know, even starting with a master's program, you still have a very, very difficult time just getting enough bodies, Kenyans, who are going to teach those courses. But it so happens because we have a field school that we've been running in collaboration with Stony Brook University, where we bring American faculty and students to study for a semester, a regular semester and a summer semester. That if we put those courses together, and then we did some online classes, we could offer a master's degree. And we're now talking to our colleagues so that, you know, and this talking about a COVID opportunity, is that, you know, most everybody is now being pushed to teach their classes online. And so once you have that information online, it is easy to share it with anybody anywhere. So we're looking at ways of delivering a very high quality curriculum to universities in Kenya in this subject and helping to train a core mass of people in these disciplines. But I think China would be a good example. I remember when I went to graduate school in the 80s, the Chinese were sending sending large numbers of their young people to study and acquire expertise in Europe and America. And then they were going back and helping to build the programs. And now you can see what's going on in China. So I think it begins with the university. I think it begins with the policy, us convincing the policy influencers that we're not going to go anywhere without developing these disciplines, and that they need to invest. The amount of investment that we put in research and we put in universities in Africa is really, really a very small fraction of our total budgets, and we need to make that investment. So we begin with the universities, train those people, and then they're the people who are then going to train teachers, and they're the ones who are going to write the curriculum, and then it percolates down into the secondary schools and into the primary schools. So yeah, so I think in a nutshell, universities and then secondary and primary schools curriculum.
There a question of mindsets that seems to stand in the way, in the sense that you actually alluded to this in your talk. You spoke about paleontology being viewed as an esoteric, you know, subject, and someone in the audience is reflecting on that, and they're saying that in the 1970s, health research was in the same position as paleontology, but now there is a rapidly growing cohort of African international research leaders. And we do know that, you know, things like, you know, health sciences, agriculture, they have an immediate and sort of very visible, you know, understanding of why they matter. And so they're asking, in practical terms, how do we get paleontology to this level? Very quickly, that would
right. Yeah, I think it begins with we start with the framing, because we start off by framing what are the problems, what are the big problems that we want our education research programs to solve. And immediately, because we think about big existential problems. So, you know, if you're not healthy, if you can't eat, so food security, health, I think those are important problems. I've had these discussions where and not only us, everybody's engaged in this discussion about identifying what are the key existential threats that we want to be able to solve. You know, climate change is a big and is increasingly becoming we're increasingly becoming aware. I mean, 20 years ago, the world was not aware; they were not taking it seriously. But now we know that, you know, this is a serious problem that we need to contend with. Pandemic is another one that we all agree is a serious existential threat for all humans that we need to deal with, and COVID-19 has brought that home. You know, so it's a matter of convincing people that this really threatens your life, and if you don't arrange yourself properly, you're not going to be able to survive. And I always tell people that for me and for Africans, our biggest existential threat that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis is just the color of our skin. It's just trying to operate. It's just trying to stay alive based on the color of your skin. I mean, it's so obvious we don't even see it. We don't recognize it. You know, so much of the problems that we have is not because we can't grow food. And even when we can't grow food, if you look at it again, you know, if you look at the farming and you see with COVID in the United States, the number of Black people who are dying, the percentage of Black people who are dying, of the people who are dying, the percentage of Black people is very high. Again, it's the color of our skin. So it's this notion where we think that because we have independence, because we passed the Emancipation Proclamation Act, or we passed this act in the United States, that we're free, but we ain't free, you know? And if we really begin to understand that we're not free, and what is it that is holding us, you know, what is holding us is not obvious laws like you can't drink here or you can't, you know, but it's this cultural construct that we have in place, very resilient, very tough. And so getting ourselves to be aware of it. And I think of people like me, we're like canaries in the coal mine. We tell you whether there's gas in there or not. So we're singing. We got to get our policy makers next to realize that, hey, this is important. Without tackling this, you're not going anywhere. You know, so I think in the framing, we just got to start with the framing, and we got to elevate this and realize that this dealing with the racial caste system is and destroying it and deconstructing it is just as important as being able to feed our people and being able to make sure that our people are healthy.
Thank you. Alison, I'm going to come to you with a question that feels a little bit elusive, a little bit like an elephant in the room, and that is of funding. So, of course, you have a very elaborate and clear path on how we could help to do some of this important work about being in charge of our future and research in African universities. But someone here is asking, does Africa need to pursue a crude model of capitalism to have the investment required for research and development in cutting-edge science in Africa? So obviously, clearly, if one is thinking beyond the University of Cape Town and possibly beyond South Africa, how are we going to get the resources to gear up? Over to you, Alison.
Wow, that's quite a question, as you say. My initial response is, I don't think that African research universities necessarily need to buy into capitalism. I think getting funding for research is, a lot of it is around telling stories and the narrative, and very similar to what my colleague Professor Nengo is talking about, which is we need to convince, I think, first ourselves in South Africa, in Africa as a whole, and then more broadly, that these research projects are vital and that they are the key to the future of humanity, the future of the planet. I showed in my talk how massive Africa is as a continent and how significant our population is going to be in the next 20 to 30 years. So Africa has the potential to be a very, very big and major player in the world. And I don't think that our major constraint is lack of capitalism or lack of research funding. To me, the first constraint is the kind of the way that we frame the narrative around what we can offer and who we are. And I do think once we get clear on the fact that we can be the major players and that we have a worthwhile agenda, then I think that funding will follow.
Right. And again, a related question, therefore, what role, if indeed there is one, do you think there is for collaborations between African universities and universities in Oxford in the future?
I think there's a huge role, not just for collaboration with Oxford, but African universities collaborating amongst themselves and collaborating with universities all over the world. I've always found it interesting that as an academic, I have so many global collaborators that are transboundary. And the reason that we are able to collaborate is because we have common agendas and common purposes. So I think already there's a kind of a global academic network of universities and academics that talk to each other no matter which countries they're from. I do think the Oxford Africa, South Africa collaboration is particularly interesting. I'm sure that there could be fantastically interesting discussions around decolonization, and I know there's some really interesting activities happening or have been happening at Oxford. And I think that could be a really good starting point for new conversations, new ways of collaborating that don't have Oxford as the senior partner and the African university as the recipient of the grant, but a peer-to-peer collaboration. Yes, I think that could be, I mean, I think there's fantastic potential there.
Right, and how about scholarships? There's someone who's wondering, do you think stopping international scholarships and encouraging students to study in their home countries would be positive or negative?
The questions are getting harder, Watu. I think there's a huge positive benefit in having international scholarships, and forcing people to stay at home, I think, is counterproductive and probably will backfire. The difficult thing is that I think you want people to go out and experience the world and become true global citizens, but also want to be part of their home country. So to me, I wouldn't stop it at the source. I would say, let people go, let people explore the world, and let's build global collaborations. I think a lot of African scholars who do get international scholarships, if they don't come home, they at least spend some of their time on the African continent. And I think we just have to strengthen that rootedness a little bit more.
Right. So I'm now going to ask you, we have at least 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask each of you to give us any concluding thoughts, you might not have been able to share during your 15-minute talk, or anything else that you want to leave us with as a parting shot. I'll start with Isaiah, please.
Right. So it's one important thing that I didn't address is that we've now spent over 150 years. You've had hundreds and hundreds of scientists, mostly from the West, coming to Africa. And we spent over 150 years collecting all these pieces of evidence. And we have these incredibly important collections that are sequestered in various institutions in South Africa, in Ethiopia, in Kenya and Tanzania primarily, and then in other countries in Africa as well. But we have thousands of pieces of fossil evidence that tell the story about how we became human. We also have very large collections of natural history specimens that have been collected over the last 150 years. Some of birds, insects, and things like that that have now gone extinct. So the only places we have them is in these collections. They're incredibly important reference collections that are going to serve us in research in agriculture and research in biomedicine and things like that. And we have not made the appropriate investment to ensure that these collections are safe. I'm incredibly worried. Me and many of our colleagues who know how important these collections are incredibly worried. So all those key fossils that I talked about, whether it is the fossils that tell us the origin of bipedalism or things like that. We really have to ensure that they are safe. And I think that not only our governments, but also the international community, because this is every human being's story. And it really is important that for the global community to participate in the process of providing the resources to help care and make sure that these collections are safe. And then I just like to again emphasize that that we are not free yet. That our thinking that we were free, we are not free yet. We have a lot of work to be done, but we're resilient. I think human beings are resilient, and that's the story that we learn. We've gone through some tough times. Human beings have come close to extinction at least a couple of times that we know of, where our populations dwindled to a few thousand people, but we made it through. I think we're very resilient. I think Africans are very resilient. You know, in spite of all the tough things that we've gone through, we've managed to survive. And so I think that I'm hopeful. And if we can just organize ourselves, I think Africa is the future, and the rest of the world needs Africa. Africa is not going to replace anyone. We're just going to make everybody stronger. That's all I would like to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alison.
Thank you very much. I don't have much more to add, except I suppose to echo similar sentiments. And if I think about what the overall message I'd like to give out of my talk, it would be to question the misrepresentation of Africa, and to question our assumptions, and to question our narrative. And yes, I suppose I'd like to leave you with that actually to be curious around what kind of assumptions we make, what narratives we tell ourselves, and what the possibilities are if we were to see beyond the current framing. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Two very fantastic talks. I hope everybody enjoyed them. We are not free yet. And as Alison has just pointed out, we have to carry on asking ourselves questions, challenging assumptions, writing our own stories, because Africa is the future. So thank you very much for being with us today, and would like to give you a big round of virtual applause for being with us today. And thank you to all the people who have joined us on the platform to listen to the two incredible talks. Our next Insaka will be in a month's time, and we hope that you'll be able to join us then again. So thank you very much, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon. See you next time. Bye-bye.